After World War II, history paved the way for a new era of conflict that would officially begin in 1947, an era known as the Cold War. This era of secrecy houses the key to a large portion of the franchise's history. The time has come to dive deep into the Civil War and explore events leading up to the franchise's iconic Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. Events like the space race between America and the Soviet Union, along with the unwritten history of the soldier that led the Allies to victory in World War II, the legendary soldier known as the Boss. Welcome to Part 2 of Metal Gear Lore. By this time, key characters of the franchise like John, most commonly known as Jack, Eva, Adamska, Dr. Clark, Donald Anderson, Roy Campbell, Huey Emmerich, Dr. Strangelove, and Kaz Miller had already been born. Key players like David O, the Boss, and the Cobra Unit survived World War II. The Philosopher's Legacy, a fortune worth over $100 billion, worth $1.3 trillion in our present day, was stolen and monopolized by Soviet patriot Boris Volgin, and the three branches of the Philosophers would soon begin to compete for the retrieval of this fortune to become the dominant superpower. The stage was set to kick into gear the era of conflict known as the Cold War. It was during this time that John, known most commonly as Jack, took part in his first missions as a rookie soldier. His military career dates as far back as June 25, 1950, the beginning of the Korean War. Jack participated in this war at the young age of 15. It was also at this age that Jack met the Boss. The two quickly became drawn to each other, and the Boss took Jack under her wing as her apprentice, training him in combat, weaponry, demolition, and intel gathering techniques. At some point, Jack took part in survival training exercises, during which he ate his first snake. In the years to follow, the connection between the two would grow further. In 1951, the Boss became involved in Operation Buster Jangle, a nuclear test conducted in Area 7 in Nevada. The Boss was exposed to high levels of radiation, rendering her infertile. Jack suffered a similar fate in 1954 when he became involved in the Bikini Atoll test of the first airborne detonation of a hydrogen bomb. The Boss soon came to learn that she was drawn to Jack because she and her apprentice shared similar fates. In the years to come, tensions escalated between the three branches of the Philosophers, their respective governments, and various other nations. As the Civil War progressed, a pivotal time came on October 4th, 1957, when the USSR launched the Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite launched into space. The Americans, having believed that they had been the world's leading nation in technological advancement, were in shock to learn the hard truth. Shock soon turned into fear as they contemplated the prospect of the Soviet Union using spaceflight technology to enhance their rockets and nuclear missiles. From this day forth, the US began to throw everything they had into the space race. In the following year, on February 1st, 1958, America launched its first satellite, the Explorer 1, and on July 29th, America established the agency responsible for the country's space program, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. Months later, on October 7th of the same year, Project Mercury, the first human spaceflight program of the United States proposed by NASA, was approved. This shift in priority became the stepping stone that would lead into the Boss's most tragic 5 years. But during the time, the Boss continued to train Jack, teaching him everything there was to know about combat, weaponry, survival, espionage, destruction, psychology, and foreign languages. Then, together, they developed a new combat system known as CQC, or Close Quarters Combat. This basic yet powerful style of combat would come to revolutionize warfare. It was not until June 12, 1959 that the boss and Jack went their separate ways. At around noon, the boss abandoned Jack without an explanation. She had no choice but to leave after her presence had been requested by President Eisenhower for a top-secret mission that would aid the lagging US get ahead of the USSR in the space race. The operation involved stealing the Soviets' ideas and technology and sabotaging their space program by sending an operative to plant a sleeper agent inside a Soviet research institute. The government couldn't think of anyone else better for the job than the legendary soldier, the boss. The mission was complicated enough as it was, since the Soviet Union had gone to great lengths to shroud their space program in secrecy, but matters were further complicated by the CIA, who did not appreciate the president going over their heads when choosing the boss to undertake this mission. Having their feathers ruffled, the CIA refused to provide any sort of support. Having no manpower or extra intel to support her, left to her own devices, the boss had no choice but to utilize a method that she knew would come back to haunt her. For the first time, she decided to tap into the Philosopher's Network to gain the necessary intel and resources to fulfill her mission. The boss took advantage of rebel members of the Russian philosophers who were not happy with a one-party communist state. She reached out to them, working tirelessly to get them on her side, trying to find a way into OKB-1, the Soviets' premier design bureau. Her manipulative methods against these members of the Russian philosophers not only risked her life, but also the life of her child, Adamska, who had been snatched away by the philosophers shortly after birth, but she risked it all without question to fulfill her duty. In the end, the boss succeeded in planting a sleeper agent inside OKB-1. It was not long after before NASA began receiving huge volumes of technical data from the Soviet program. By the end of 1959, the data had been used to make significant progress in America's own space program. It was only after the boss's operation was successful that the CIA took over to take all the credit. To the CIA's benefit, glory was the furthest thought from the boss's mind. To the boss, only her duty to her country mattered. After the CIA's takeover, throughout the 1960s, NASA continued to obtain data from the sleeper agent planted within OKB-1. Using the agent's intel, NASA seemed to be making great strides towards manned spaceflight. Furthermore, data from the sleeper agent indicated that the Soviet space program was lagging behind, with reports of panic and constant failures on the Soviet side, along with reports of constant successes in the agent's attempts at sabotage. The Americans also came to learn that they had the significant advantage of being able to recover their spacecraft from the ocean upon re-entry, while the Soviet Union would have to bring its spacecraft down by land, since Russia only bordered the frozen Arctic. This meant the Soviets had the extra task to figure out how to soften the blow of the landing enough to safely bring a living human back to Earth. To the Americans' pleasure, the sleeper agent reported that the Soviets had not found a solution to this problem, along with the fact that the Soviet space program had not advanced enough to begin testing on humans. Proud of the progress and strides they were making, the Americans bought the stories fed by the sleeper agent without question. All were complacent, all but the boss. To her, circumstances were too good to be true. Her suspicions were further aroused when she discovered discrepancies in one of the Soviet blueprints that the sleeper agent had provided. The discrepancy revolved around the Sputnik 5, which for some reason contained some kind of an ejector seat. The boss found it suspicious that an ejector seat would be installed when the sleeper agent reported that the Soviet space program was still testing spaceflight on animals. She informed both NASA and the CIA of her suspicions, but NASA shrugged her off while the CIA ignored her, believing this was the boss's attempt to regain her former glory. She had no choice but to infiltrate the OKB-1 Soviet Union research facility by herself without any support. At around the same time, late in the year, on September of 1960, two male NSA codebreakers, codenamed Adam and Eva, defected to the Soviet Union. The agent named Adam was none other than Adamska, son of the boss, born on D-Day in the middle of battlefield and taken shortly after birth by agents of the philosophers. It is unknown what transpired during his captivity. As for Agent Eva, his identity would soon be stolen by a female Chinese spy who would play a pivotal role in the Metal Gear lore in the years to come. By the beginning of the following year, 1961, the boss succeeded in infiltrating the OKB-1 research facility, but only to find out the hard truth that the sleeper agent she had planted had defected to the Soviet Union. The sleeper agent had been feeding the Americans false information. All of the agent's reports from the Soviet Union's many failures, their lagging technology, and the agent's successful sabotage had all been nothing short of lies. Contrary to what the defected agent had reported, the Soviets' manned spaceflight technology had become quite advanced. While feeding false information to the Americans, he had also fed the Soviet Union with America's intelligence operations. But what shocked the boss most was the reason for the sleeper agent's defection. The CIA's Axis agent had been pocketing a large sum of the sleeper agent's paycheck. Feeling that what little pay he earned was not worth the risk of the mission, he defected to the Soviet Union after he was offered a higher sum by Moscow. The boss also confirmed her suspicions regarding the Sputnik 5. The ejector seat was meant to eject a human pilot after the spacecraft re-enters the atmosphere, to have the pilot parachute down the rest of the way. In other words, contrary to prior reports and belief, the Soviet space program had indeed solved the problem of softening the blow of the spacecraft's re-entry by land. The Soviet Union's manned spaceflight program had become far more advanced than anyone could have anticipated. Upon her many discoveries, the boss passed on the information to NASA. What was initially a dream within reach had now turned into the agency's worst nightmare. The CIA was also none the wiser, but instead of taking the blame for their failure, the CIA devised an ingenious plan to avoid taking responsibility. On January 20th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy was inaugurated into office. Fortunately for the CIA, he was none the wiser about the case history when taking office, allowing the CIA to feed lies to the administration, to twist their story to shift blame upon the boss. The CIA blamed her for choosing an unreliable sleeper agent, leaving out their own ineptities. She was also blamed for not using more effective means, like holding the sleeper agent's family hostage to ensure the agent's loyalty. The boss was well aware of this methodology, but after having her own child taken by the philosophers, she could not bring herself to inflict the same pain upon another. In the end, the boss did not argue or complain, and she was deemed no better than a traitor by the new president. To pay for her supposed failures, for the months to come, she was to become NASA's guinea pig for their manned spaceflight program, the Mercury Project, taking part in experimental tests like the High G test, Zero G test, spacesuit test, simulations in pressurized oxygen environments, and more. Too dangerous for the 7 candidates chosen as astronauts for the Mercury Project, the Mercury 7. She alone was made to endure tests intended for 7 individuals. Despite these unjust circumstances, the boss did not complain or argue her side of the story. She kept quiet, seeing it as her duty to accept her role as a guinea pig. She saw herself as a potentially valuable asset to these tests because of her military experience. Furthermore, she went above and beyond her role by drawing on her experience to give the staff of the program, along with the Mercury 7, the exact focused advice that they needed to ensure the success of this mission. Because of her contributions, NASA's program took off once again. Impressed with the boss, the agency soon took to calling her the 8th astronaut, the Mercury Lady. It was only soon after that the boss met Dr. Strangelove, a NASA scientist who would come to develop great affection for the legendary soldier. By this time, Dr. Strangelove had already met Emmerich, who worked alongside her. She gave him the nickname Huey after the crippled service droid in the movie Silent Running, mainly because Huey too was crippled, having been born paraplegic or unable to walk due to his abnormally shaped spine. It is still unknown how big of a role Huey played in the Mercury project or if he became acquainted with the boss, but it is certain that Dr. Strangelove played a pivotal role, overseeing the entire project to do everything in her power to ensure the boss's safety. Things were looking up for NASA and their beloved project, but one day, after the government received intelligence that Soviet spaceships were being built with windows, they demanded that NASA do the same with their own spacecraft. The government wanted to ensure that America didn't do anything less than the Russians, and they wanted to ensure that the astronaut would be able to see space to tell the tale. NASA had already been facing impossible deadlines, but the addition of another element of uncertainty only worsened matters. The addition of a window would both weaken the spacecraft and make it harder to shield the occupant from cosmic rays. The government could not have such dangers befall upon the beloved Mercury 7, and since technology to block out cosmic rays had yet to be developed, they chose someone who had already been irradiated, the boss, as the project's pilot. Despite only being given a 20% chance of returning to Earth alive, the boss did not complain, working every day to ensure the success of her mission, serving her country to the end. Strangelove knew of the implications of adding a window. Her developing affections for the legendary soldier made her do everything in her power to stop the boss from participating in the launch, attempting things like reporting the boss's brain injury from her mission in 1943 involving the assassination of falsely accused John von Neumann. During the mission, she had learned that she was pregnant with a child, a distraction that led to her injury. But the boss stopped her, eager to fulfill her duties. Matters worsened further when on April 11, 1961, out of the blue, the US received intelligence that the USSR was ready to launch their Vostok rocket the next day, April 12, 1961. America refused to let the Soviets beat them in the space race, so in a desperate move, NASA was forced to cut short the testing process to ensure that their own rocket would launch in the earliest hours of the next day. America's actions resembled those of students desperately studying last minute for their upcoming test. Despite the many risks involved in this operation, despite knowing that the spacecraft and testing were far from complete, and despite knowing that she had only completed less than 80% of regular flight procedures, the boss jumped into the spacecraft, knowing there was a high chance she would not make it back alive. On April 12, 1961, at 1:30 in the morning, the boss successfully and miraculously entered space, with Yuri Gagarin, officially the first human to travel to space in our real-world history, following only a few short minutes after. As cosmic rays bombarded the boss, she saw Earth from above. The sight of this perfect jewel sparkled her dream to unite the planet's inhabitants and to see a world without communism or capitalism. Unfortunately for the boss, her moment of bliss was short-lived. While Gagarin orbited the Earth and safely returned to the Soviet Union, the boss's Mercury capsule was thrown off balance during re-entry due to the added window, leading the capsule to crash land into the ocean. Despite her many injuries, the boss miraculously survived and was safely hospitalized, but she succumbed to a coma that would last for 6 months. The boss would never come to know of Dr. Strangelove's affection, and the two would never see each other again. Dr. Strangelove had always known that the boss's attention was focused on another individual, an individual whose identity would go unknown to her until she meets him 13 years later. Despite the boss's sacrifice, NASA and the government only cared about the hard truth. In the end, the boss had lost the space race to Gagarin by only a few minutes. Rather than celebrating America's first manned spaceflight, the boss's accomplishment was kept out of the history books after the government's realization that their own tale of heroic survival would not even come close to what the Soviets had achieved. An orbital flight with the safe return of both pilot and spacecraft. America, by comparison, had only achieved a ballistic trajectory flight ending with a crash landing. Disheartened, enraged, and jealous, America decided to unleash their resentment upon the boss, deciding that her story of accomplishments wasn't one worth telling. She was expunged from the flight records and edited out of any pictures she had taken alongside the Mercury 7. The Mercury lady was, in essence, removed from existence. As for the boss's accident, the military covered it up by claiming that the boss partook in the unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, and in 6 months, the boss would wake up to become a scapegoat for America to unleash their resentment upon. Shortly after the boss had been hospitalized, rocket scientist Nikolai Stepanovich Sokolov, the man most responsible for the success of the Vostok A-1, the rocket that sent Yuri Gagarin to space, under Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's orders, began to work on a nuclear-armed tank known as the Shagohod, a machine that would shatter the idea of nuclear deterrence upon completion. While the boss recovered from her coma, Jack became involved in CIA-sanctioned covert operations during the early stages of the Vietnam War. It was during this time that Jack met Python, one of few soldiers that Jack could completely rely on in battle. During one of the covert missions, Python was shot and presumed dead. 9 years later, Jack would learn that Python had survived, and the two would meet again. Despite being heavily involved in American operations, Jack would still constantly wonder about the day the boss abandoned him without notice. Without knowledge of the boss's whereabouts or what she had been through, he would count the years, months, days, and hours from the time the boss, his spiritual mother, had suddenly abandoned him, right up until the time they would meet again in 1964 during the Virtuous Mission.